Randy, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Joe.
Yes. I think they saw you not too long ago over in Boston at the Chief Data Officer and Chief AI Officer Summit. So it's pretty cool. Um, and I got to admit, this is it's a bit newer of a world to me. This is a world you've been operating in for a long, long time, as working with executives in the world of data. How did you get into this?
Well, it's been a long time,
Yeah.
and actually 40 years. But I
Okay.
started in industry. As things would happen, I actually studied English and history and the liberal arts, art history, all that kind of stuff. But when it was time to get a job, the jobs were basically in technology, and it was the early days. And I wanted to go into banking. So I went to work for Bank of America, which was a Bank of Boston, which is a predecessor bank to Bank of America. And they trained me as a COBOL and assembler programmer.
Hmm.
But I wasn't so much interested in the programming. I was interested in the stuff that you move around, which was the data. And at that time, I had gone to somebody who was one of the managers, and I said, "What do you do with all this data? You have all this information on your customers, their behaviors, all of their activities." They said, "Oh, the regulators make us hold on to it for 7 years, and then we can destroy it." And I was like, "What? That doesn't seem like the right thinking." So really, from that point forward, I became an advocate for how organizations could use data to gain insights into their customers, to improve customer service and customer treatment, and gain insights into their business. I spent a decade with a company that was a pioneer in database marketing, company called Hard Hanks, and I ran their North American financial services practice and also their business to business practice, and worked in that context with organizations like Federal Express and Microsoft. And when worked with Microsoft, when I was called out there and walked into the room, the person that was sitting at the other end of the table was Steve Ballmer. And he said, "This is too important to delegate to anyone." So he became
Wow.
the point person for the data initiative for Microsoft. This was in 1996, 1997. And then in the internet era, I did two venture-backed startups in Silicon Valley as a co-founder, part of the founding team. And when everything came crashing down in that sector in 2001, I started a company called New Vantage Partners, who were advisors to Fortune 1000 companies on data strategy, data leadership. Worked with organizations such as American Express, Wells Fargo, MetLife, The Hartford, Charles Schwab, MasterCard. About 80% in financial services and 20% in healthcare and life sciences, and ran that company for 20 years until 2021, and then sold it to a Paris-based global consultancy, Wavestone, where I've served as innovation fellow for the past 2 years, and then I retired this month.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
But you're still doing podcasts, so
Yeah, and the other thing I didn't mention is I do a lot of writing and speaking. So as
yeah.
data escalated in prominence, particularly in the early 2010s with the use of the term big data. I was invited by the Wall Street Journal to write a monthly column, so I did that for 2 years, 2014, 2015. Have continued that in Forbes, and also write regularly for Harvard Business Review, about 3 columns a year, and MIT Sloan Management Review, same thing.
Wow. Okay.
And I wrote a
That's
book.
and you wrote a book.
Yeah,
Congrats.
fast, learn faster, lessons in data-driven leadership in an age of disruption, big data, and AI. And I did that in COVID.
Hmm.
I really preferred writing articles, but I had the time and couldn't travel anywhere, so I put it all into a book.
It happens. I know how it goes. So, walk me through this though. I didn't understand, I guess, the scope or the longevity of how long you've been working in data, particularly with a bend towards, I guess, strategy and quote getting value out of it, which you can probably unpack what that means to you. But I'm curious. You've been around the block. You've seen a lot of trends. What's what are some of the Have you seen inflection points in the industry? And if so, what were some of the inflection points that stand out?
Yeah, quite a few. But I would say to the first part of your question, I'm a huge believer in business value. In
Okay.
other words, one of the things I say to organizations these days, I mean, the first time I said it, I thought people would be really offended.
Why is that?
I've sharpened the message. What I said is, if you're not getting value, business value, measurable business value from your data and analytics investments, you should shut them down completely right now. Okay. People say, wow, that sounds kind of extreme and urgent, but if you can't measure the return on the dollars that you're putting in, why would you continue to do it? So that's a point I make to a lot of organizations, and I really encourage this notion of that data and AI investments be very closely tied to the business with strong business sponsorship, very focused on answering key business questions that are tied to business goals and outcomes for the organization. So that's kind of my inherent bias in all of that. In terms of inflection points, well, have lived through a few.
Yeah.
25 years ago, what was the emergence of digital and the beginning of the digital transformation. And I guess the point I'd make about that is now with generative AI, this is probably the biggest inflection that I've personally seen since that time, so in the past 25 years. But the thing that I tell people is that, if you're a digitally native company, the Googles, the Apples, Facebook, etc., you're in a different position than traditional legacy companies. So if you look at the Fortune 1000 today, roughly 10% are the digitally native companies that have emerged over the past 25 years. Many of them have the highest market capitalization. But the other 90% are legacy companies that have existed for as far back as, into the mid 19th century.
Hmm.
And if you're part of that 90%, you can't really, and you shouldn't be thinking about trying to compete with the Googles and Facebook, et cetera. You should really be competing with the other 90%. So as a consequence, the digitally native companies, their adoption of digital capabilities was from the outset. So it was years and years ahead. And for the rest of the legacy companies, it's been a gradual progression over time to the degree that one Fortune 1000 chief digital officer and chief data officer said to me about 2.5, 3 years ago that they did more in terms of the implementation of their digital strategy during COVID than they had in the previous 20 years. And that was really out of necessity because they had to really learn to live and die by interacting with their customers on a
Mm.
basis. Other inflection points, people make fun of this now, but, when big data came into usage, it really elevated the discussion in the C-suites and at the board level, because before that, often data people and data issues were relegated to the back office or to the bowels of an organization, but it really became something where organizations said, we need to establish a data strategy. As a matter of fact, after the financial services crisis and in 2007, 2008, and going into the big data era, it really precipitated the launch of the chief data officer role. I
Right.
think you mentioned that have been running a survey for the past 12 years of Fortune 1000 companies, their top C executives, roughly 90% of the respondents are chief data or chief data and analytics officers. But in 2012, we asked these companies, how many of you have appointed a chief data officer? And only 12% said yes. This year it was 83.2%
Really?
said yes. So it's really been, it's gone from a very nascent role to a role that's become commonplace and widely adopted. And even looking back 5 years at 2017, it was at 55.9% that they had. So it really
Interesting.
took, about 5 years or so or longer to get any type of foothold. In the past 5 years, it's taken off pretty dramatically.
That's really fascinating. Uh, why do you think that is? Why do you think the chief data officer role has grown so quickly over the
Yeah,
last few years, especially because that's a pretty big bump, what 30% or something like that. So
yeah.
almost,
I
yeah,
would say two things. Yeah, I mean, it's almost been 100% increase in many respects, or
sure,
70%, 80%. Well, the demand for expertise and leadership in data and analytics will only increase. Okay, it's not something that's going to go away. So that demand for data analytics and AI leadership, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And when I say soon, I'm talking many years and decades. But the other side of that is we ask every year whether the role is successful and well established. Over in 2020, only a quarter of organizations, 27.9, said the role was really successful. Last
Mm,
year, 4 years later, it was 35% said it was successful. This year was the biggest leap, and I'll talk a little bit about that because everything seems due to the embrace of generative AI. But this year it leapt to 51%. But still, that says that 50% of organizations are still struggling to make the role successful and still struggling with the tenure of data leaders. And we also asked whether the role was well understood within companies, and over half said the role was poorly understood. So it's a new role, it's a nascent role,
yeah.
there's a need, but it's still a work in progress.
It reminds me a lot of this Wall Street Journal article I read a month or two ago, where it was about chief marketing officers, and very similar to what you described, where the CEOs felt like they understood what a chief marketing officer should do. I think a vast majority of them, I don't remember the stat, but I think it was 22% of chief marketing officers felt the CEO understood what they were
Yeah.
supposed to be doing. Um, is a similar disparity in expectations or understanding exists in the chief data officer role as well? Do you think?
Well, there's challenges with any new role. I mean, the
Uh huh.
CIO role only came into play about a generation ago, and I remember at the
Hmm.
time the joke was that CIO stood for career is over. The tenures were so short.
Oh
If you
boy.
have the benefit of having seen that, what's happening with the chief data officer is kind of like, yeah, that's what happens. The role's new. Organizations don't have a clear expectation or understanding of
Yeah.
what the mandate should be. There's no reporting structures that are universally in place. I mean, I've seen chief data officers that report from everything from the chief marketing officer to the CEO to the CFO to the chief risk officer to the CIO and CTO. So depending upon the company, depending upon how they envision the role, there's a wide disparity.
Hmm. And backing up real quick, you used the word successful when you're describing these results. What does successful mean?
Well, a lot of that is in the eyes of the beholder, and a lot
Yeah.
of questions that I ask in the survey are subject to interpretation. But it's asked as a pretty straight question. Do you consider it the role to be successful and well established or not?
Right.
So each person may come to their own conclusions. I mean, one of the things that we ask in the survey each year is the progress of data and analytics initiatives,
Mm,
and used to ask something where people could kind of hedge their bets and say like, oh, we're doing pretty good, or things of that kind. But I turned it into a binary yes no question. So I said, are you driving business innovation with data, yes or no? This
right.
year, last year it was like 59% said yes. This year it leaped to 77%. Said, are you competing on data and analytics? Last year it was 40%. This year, again, with that generative AI boost, it went up to 50%. We said, are you managing data as a business asset? Last year was 39%. This year it jumped to 49%. Two more. Have you created a data-driven organization? Last year it was only 23%. This year it practically doubled, more than doubled, to 48%. And we asked, have you established a data and analytics culture? And this had been notoriously poor over the years. Last year was only 20%. But this year, again, everything skyrocketed. And this year it was 42%. So we try to force
Interesting.
people to give an answer that's binary, as opposed to saying, well, kind of, maybe, sort of.
Yeah, but if I'm looking at the results, then it seems like almost 100% growth increases over across the board in some of these like 20 to 40. What do you think is accounting for all this?
Yeah, Tom Davenport and I co-authored the foreword, and we said, as a matter of fact, the title of our article that appeared in MIT Sloan Review this week, and I'm going to cheat here a minute because I'm going to look it up because I
Oh, no
want
worries.
to exactly right, was survey. Generative AI is making companies more data oriented. Okay, so the point there is that over the course of the year, particularly in the beginning of the year after ChatGPT was released late last year, a lot of CEOs and boards turned to the chief data officers, the data leaders in the company, and said, what's our AI strategy? How are we going to respond to this? So it really elevated the whole discussion, which then drove down into, well, the quality of our AI depends upon the quality of our data. Well, what are we doing about our data? How are we leverage it? How are we ensuring greater data quality? What are the things that we're doing to create a data-driven organization? So all of those questions that for a number of years CDOs were saying, hey, we have all this data and we could help. Now all of a sudden it was being driven from the top of the organization. They were saying, what are your data capabilities and what do we need to do to elevate this and what do we need to do to invest in this and how do we tie it to business outcomes? So, like a rising tide, a rising tide lifts all ships.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, when's the last time you've seen such top-down support for these types of initiatives? And by these types, I mean either technology, data initiatives, or related.
25 years ago with the arrival of the internet, unequivocally. I mean, people have said to me, like, oh, is this equivalent to the introduction of the printing press? Is this equivalent to the introduction of the locomotive, the railroad? I said, well, I can't really comment on the former two, but
Yeah, wasn't around then.
my lifetime or my professional career, it's exactly like the arrival of the internet.
Let me rewind a bit then. So back then, what were the driving factors behind wanting to jump onto the internet?
Well, I was talking to somebody this morning and I was just saying that, back in the day, you went into the typewriter, you went into the word processor, and you created a document that said, here are my ideas. You went around the organization and you put it on people's desk, or you put it in the mail and you put a stamp on it and you sent it across the country and so forth. And that was the speed with which business operated. So it completely transformed everything in terms of making feedback possible in real time.
Hmm.
I mean, we take it for granted today, but it's
Yeah,
looking back, it's I can't imagine how got anything done.
it is hard to imagine. Um, and I remember the conversations back then too. I was lucky or unlucky enough to have an internet account back in or connection back in 1992. I think it was. It was a teenager who was on the. I was beta. I used to beta test the Mosaic browser back when I was still a kid. But I remember there was talk back then that the internet was a fad. Like this is going to go away. Like it doesn't really offer anything new. And obviously here we are today chatting over the internet to do a podcast, which is also internet related. So it's interesting, I think, because I see some of the same arguments around generative AI right now, like, oh, this is stupid, it's a fad. But I've personally learned to not dismiss anything out of hand. Like it's um, but what was it about generative AI though that you think caught people's attention? Because it's not like machine learning or AI is new. I mean, we've been doing a lot of machine learning for a long time, and deep learning, which underpins generative AI. I mean, that's been around for, gosh, a decade now. What do you think it was about generative AI that caught people's attention all of a sudden?
Well, I'd make two comments. Back to the internet.
Yeah.
I remember what it's called, the information superhighway.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Okay, and then there was all this excitement and euphoria about the arrival of the internet, and then people said, well, it hasn't really like changed everything, so maybe it's just kind of a fad, as you say. But it was the gradual adoption over time that it became prevalent in more and more aspects of one's life and one's work. So,
Yeah.
the early pioneering applications, et cetera. But in terms of its broadest application, that played out over years and decades.
Hmm.
So I think it's similar in many respects to AI. Now, of course, what you said is, I mean, AI has been around for as long as my entire career. I remember in my second job was working with NLP, natural language processing, and was asking like very basic questions, and it gave answers. And even a few years ago, I had a colleague who got his PhD from Yale in artificial intelligence like 30 years ago, and now all this machine learning stuff was coming along and various AI applications. And I said to him, I said, Bill, hey, your time has come. Now where AI is finally becoming relevant and in the mainstream. And he said, no, no. He says this is just a fad. He said AI is never going to happen. And this was just a few years ago. And this was somebody that
Mm,
had their PhD in it. Well, I think the
yeah.
thing that happened was that. Computing power accelerated the ability to capture data, hence big data. So there was much larger and larger data sets available with speed in a timely fashion. I remember when working with American Express, they used to work off a data sample to basically approve credit lines or credit transactions. Today, it looks at billions, if not trillions, of volumes of data in a matter of seconds, and not
Mhm.
only for you but for everybody that's on a particular transaction to see if there's an outlier. So I think it's the prevalence of data that's now finally
Yeah.
made it so that AI can generate results that have a high degree of probability.
Oh, yeah, which the internet enabled, right? I mean, I think I distinctly remember too going from, modems to, broadband, and that changed everything,
Yeah,
It's sort of the same epoch you see right now with, higher powered GPUs and better hardware. I mean, that's almost the equivalent of broadband in a lot of ways, what
yeah,
happened back then. 'Cause you couldn't achieve these sorts of, large scale parameter trainings without more hardware that we have now. It just wouldn't really work that way. So, but much the same way, you would never have gotten to this point if you were still on copper cable or copper wire modems, because the data amounts would never have grown. Just because, So it's funny just kind of how everything sort of goes full circle on itself, where the internet sort of gave rise to more data, which then gave rise to more what we have today. So,
yeah. And to your our question amidst the questions was that
yep.
over the course of this year, people have said, "Oh, what do you think of generative AI?" And I've been very cautious in responding. I'd said, well, there's positive opportunities in terms of greater productivity, upscaling of jobs, things of that kind, but there's also risks associated with things like misinformation and
Hmm.
disinformation and job loss and ethical bias and those type of things. But I had the opportunity in October to go to the Wall Street Journal Tech Live event in Laguna Beach, and
Nice.
it was funny because Sam Altman was the keynote speaker. A week
Mm,
later, he was fired. 2 weeks later, he was
yeah.
rehired. Bernard Kosler was there, and what's
Oh,
her name?
nice.
Fei Lee, who runs the
Mhm.
Stanford program. And I came away with an entirely different mindset than I had going into it. And that mindset was what I call inevitability. It
Yep.
doesn't matter, whether you like it, don't like it, fear it, have concerns about it, it's going to happen.
Mhm.
So you need to get used to it, plan for it, get with the program. Really as simple as that.
Yeah, and I guess from a practical sense for the companies, that you talk to, right? We're talking Fortune companies. What are some of the practical things they can be doing to either prepare for AI or implement it in their companies?
Well, I write a lot of case study stories in this context, and I write those in Forbes. And the one that I like the best of the recent ones is something that I wrote in December about Ally Financial, because what Ally
Mm,
Financial did, and they're a exclusively online bank, so they're innovative by nature, kind of in that Capital One category as opposed to more traditional banks. But they set up an environment, their own internal environment, to apply a series of use cases, and then they were going to actually test and measure the productivity. So the article I wrote was about the quantifiable productivity gains that they'd gotten through an initial set of use cases. And what I liked about that was that they went very public about it. They felt it was like their responsibility. They quantified
mm,
the results they were achieving each time they improved and tweaked their models and their business use case. And that was different because previous articles that I've written, it was more about people said, well, we're putting in place the infrastructure, we're establishing the safeguards, we've established various committees within the organization. But it was very much at a process level, and they hadn't really got into the stage of testing and getting quantifiable results. So it was really gratifying to see the Ally Financial case study. So I think that what we're seeing now is more and more organizations are reaching that stage where they're putting in place the appropriate safeguards, but they're establishing use cases and they're testing them and coming up with the quantifiable results, and then figuring how they can tweak that and what opportunities there are to move some of those capabilities into production.
And what are some of those capabilities right now? Because I mean, generative AI, for example, if we're just talking about that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people, like ChatGPT being integrated, or GitHub Copilot, or creating images or video or whatnot. But what are some of the things that you're seeing businesses do from a capability standpoint with generative AI?
Yeah, in the case of Ally Financial, and I can describe it at a few
Yeah,
100 feet up above.
yeah.
And that was there's a lot of customer service activities, and this
Mm,
applies across companies across industry. And they're saying, to what degree can the a machine do that more effectively than a human being? So they were testing that and validating it. I went to an event, in Boston or in Cambridge at Harvard in October, and they had one of the heads of Harvard Medical School there, and he said something that I thought was fascinating. And my wife spent her career in healthcare, so as when I'm hearing this, I'm texting it to her and I'm saying, "Is this true?" And so the first thing they said was that we have done a series of tests, and what we found is that a machine will diagnose a patient illness better than a human being 90% of the time. Okay. And this is from the head of Harvard Medical School. So I text this to my wife. I said, "Is this true?" And she's like, "Probably."
oh boy.
The next thing that they said, which was really astonishing, they said that when they did their additional tests, they found that a machine was shown to be more empathetic than the actual doctors, say in the written reports, or if it was turned into audio, the patients viewed it as much more empathetic than the actual physician, 80% of the time. And I said to her, "Is this true?" And she says, "I'm sure." And then a few weeks later, I hosted a CDO panel, and I had the chief data officer from Mayo Clinic. And so I decided I'd put him on the spot. And I said, "I was just over this thing at Harvard." And they said, 90%, machine did 90% better in diagnostics and 80% better in patient compassion. He said, "Absolutely. We did the exact same test and we came up with
What?
the exact same thing." So, there's some real measurable metrics that organizations are coming up with. And Ally Financial, the activities that they undertook in terms of improving productivity around customer service, it was in that 86, 87,
Wow.
90% range that the machine was able to fully handle everything and do a better job than the human.
Wow.
Well, they follow the rules.
I do sometimes like the customer service agents who don't, and sort of maybe give you a bit of a break. So,
But
in fact, that's one of the things I do now is I try and get a person on the phone, because I find like the chat interface that there's so many guardrails around it. I'm just like, hey, I just want to get a deal,
yeah,
So,
back in the day, this is about 15, 20 years ago, was working with a client, a large financial service, mutual fund, et cetera, company. And I can't remember what the rationale was, but when you called customer service, they viewed it as there was a correlation between the time you spent on the phone and the deepening of the relationship with the organization. So for the first 3 or 4 minutes, they'd say, "So how is the weather where you are? Did you happen to see the Patriots play this weekend?" or whatever the football. So they established 3 or 4 minutes, establishing rapport, and then they said, "So what is the question that you've called to get help with?"
interesting. Yeah, that's what Zappos was really famous for too. Was their call center where I guess they would just order you a pizza if you wanted them to, and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, something to be said for that. It kind of makes me wonder if that's and sort of if everyone's going to be using generative AI, it's sort of maybe a front line for their business. If there wouldn't be a competitive advantage to having the human touch at maybe some other points of contact with the business. I don't know.
Well,
It's an interesting one.
what all of these organizations have said to me, Ally Financial emphasized that every place has emphasized that, when we were at the Northeastern University Institute for Experiential AI,
Yeah,
virtually everybody said they emphasized the importance of the human in the loop. They all say
yeah,
human in the loop. In other words, as a corrective, as a mediator or a moderating influence, or to keep things honest, or to track what's happening and any
yep.
deviations. So, yeah, and that's in many respects, I guess, creating an important new role.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when you talk to executives at these big companies, is there any notion of what's going to happen to the people impacted by generative AI or non-generative AI too? I should throw that in.
Well, there's certain folks I talk to, and they say, "Oh my God, AI is awful. It's going to eradicate all the jobs of mankind, and it's just going to be computers doing everything." But in industry, I hear the exact opposite, and that
Mm,
is actually going to liberate people from doing the rote and mundane tasks, and the
right.
computers can be like the underlings, and the human beings can be the people that bring critical judgment and analyze the results and do the critical and creative thinking. So, I mean, I think it's inevitable that, more mundane tasks that can be done by a computer will be replaced, but there's the opportunity to elevate people in terms of the roles that they play. You can be CEO of the machine.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I try and tell this to people who work. I mean, my background's more as a data engineering practitioner and so forth, right? And so, but it's interesting. So when I talk to practitioners, they're like, "Oh, is my job going to be outsourced?" You're talking to maybe an analyst or a data engineer or a data scientist. And at least for the data scientists and data analysts, I tell them, "Look, I mean, if you're spending a lot of your time doing descriptive statistics for your job, like answering like where, like what or when type questions, like that can and probably should be automated because that's not that interesting." Those questions aren't that interesting, right? I mean, so either you start automating actions that you take on those events that are occurring, and I think the rise of more streaming data and the commoditization of that's probably going to influence more rapid actions taken. But I said this really puts you in a position where you could be answering more interesting questions like how or why, which I think you'd probably want to answer versus just what happened on this date. Like that's a pretty boring question to be frank. So
Yeah, I was doing a fireside chat interviewing someone about 2 years ago. It was an interesting thing. This person had a very far-reaching and eclectic career that started their career as tour manager for Bob Dylan, and then they
oh,
manager for Bob Dylan and the band, and a roommate of George Harrison of the Beatles, and
okay.
produced Martin Scorsese's first film, Mean Streets, then produced The Last Waltz, and then moved into various type of video on demand, and then wound up at the USC Annenberg School, focusing on technology, and that's how I got to meet
Huh.
this individual. So I was interviewing him over the range of his career, and at the end it was a Q&A, and somebody said, and he's kind of a um, just a very blunt guy. And somebody said, "So, going into this age of data and AI, should we all major in data science in college?" And he goes, "Only if you want to be replaced by an algorithm." He said, study like creative things and
Hmm.
develop your critical thinking skills. So, I don't think it's as black and white as that, but it's. I thought it was an interesting story. The
Well, it's an
person.
interesting twist too, because I think for the longest time we've been telling people, "Oh, you need to go study STEM,
Mm,
right, and learn how to code and all this stuff." I mean, I think I gave a lot of talks last year. My favorite talk still was going to my kids at that time. He is a sixth grade class and talking about AI for an hour.
mhm.
That was amazing. Easily my favorite talk. And why is that? Because these kids are going to be impacted somehow. I mean, and I think impacted in hopefully a great way where they're able to leverage a lot of these tools. But the first question I ask is, "What do you think AI is?" Like, "Oh, it's going to take over." And it's like, okay, so I have ChatGPT on my phone for this next hour. I'm gonna pass my phone around. Don't shoot nasty texts to my friends while you're at it, but just use it and let's figure out. Let's ask some questions, right? I think by the end, I think a lot of the mystique had gone away, and I think kids had a better understanding of what sort of the boundaries of at least ChatGPT were. And thought that was pretty awesome. And we kind of talked about careers and stuff, and they said very similar. I think at the end of the day, you got to kind of focus on the things you're always going to have with you is yourself, right? So find things that are going to make you happy. I think that a lot of the career advice you've been getting in school is probably going to be bad advice, to be frank, because they're telling you what to do about that's 10 years old.
Yeah,
Um,
and
so
and it's back to that point about inevitability, because if you look at technology change in perspective, railroads, airplanes later on, they dramatically shrunk time and distance and so forth. And I was reading a book earlier this year, and it was fascinating because this is my favorite example. It said it wasn't a technology, but in a way it was. It said that there were all these indigenous tribes all across America, North America, and some of them were just a few miles apart. But in the 1600s onwards, when the horse was brought from Europe, all of a sudden, the indigenous people started getting on horseback and riding down the road and finding there was like a totally new tribe that they never even knew about. So it's not that different. I mean, the
mhm,
scale is like exponentially different, but technologies have that type of transformative impact. And there's bad things that can happen, such as misinformation and disinformation, but there's all kinds of wonderful things, particularly breakthroughs in science and technology and medicine that can
mhm,
happen if you just say, hey, this is here, you have to deal with it. I mean, sometimes I make the analogy, and it's like a bad analogy. You can use a screwdriver or a hammer to fix something. You can also use a screwdriver or a hammer to assault somebody. Okay.
yeah,
So, you can use a car to get from point A to point B, or you can get a car to, run somebody over. So any type of technology, even the best technologies can be misused. So
mhm,
you should really think about, the positive ways that AI can be applied.
absolutely. And sort of, I think switching gears, but on a related note, you were a successful writer, author. In what ways do you think AI is going to impact people like yourself?
That's funny because somebody reached out to me at the beginning of last year and they said, "Hey, you know what? Instead of writing, one article per month, I can work with you and you can write like 9 articles per month using ChatGPT because we're going to write about this topic in the style of Randy Bean because you have so much content out there that I can do it." And I thought about it for a second. I said, I'd rather write one really poor article than 9 articles that I didn't really write. So, I enjoy the creative process, and I mean, different people will approach it in different ways, and some people will have ChatGPT write everything that they ever write and so forth. But
Hmm.
I enjoy the process of writing and the creativity and the synthesizing of ideas and finding the best words to express things. Even though, now when I'm typing an email or something, I'm thinking like, what's the best word to use? And then it's like showing me, and I'm like, yeah,
Yeah,
best word.
it is like that. I almost sometimes I sometimes turn that off
Yeah,
because if I can, right? Some of them just force you to use it, but it's like and other times I'm super grateful for it. I think it just depends on the type of writing you're doing, right? So I find when I'm writing articles or book drafts, I turn off sort of the autocomplete part because especially as I don't know what your style is writing. I'd love to talk to you about that, but the way I do it is I write what's called a zero draft, just do a brain dump. It doesn't matter if it's grammatically
of
correct. You're
course,
just getting the ideas out, right? And
absolutely.
yeah, and then refine it from there to first draft, and then just edit ruthlessly from there. What's your writing process like?
Well, that's funny because somebody asked me that, and you just played into it. Was that I used to have this story. Somebody said, "Oh, like it must take you like hours, days, and weeks to like write these articles. I said, no, it takes 1 hour. And they said, what
Mm,
do you mean? And I said, I block 1 hour out of my schedule and I write the article. Now that was kind of half true because what I did was I carried the idea around in my head for about a week, thinking about it when I was walking or bike riding or doing things like that. And then, then it started to crystallize. And so the first thing that I do is, basically get on Word and I dump all the content. So it had nothing to do with this final style and so forth. I just get all the ideas out that I wanted to capture. And then comes the cut and paste part where you start moving the stuff around. So actually the end, can be the beginning and then
yep.
we'll move it back to the end. No, we'll move it back to the beginning and you move the stuff around. But that's where I'd spend an hour. I'd say, I'm only going to spend an hour. Like, I have the content down there, so I'm going to spend an hour trying to like tell the story in the best way possible. And I'm not going to obsess about it. Okay, it's like the
Hmm.
best I can do in an hour, and then I'm going to push send to send it off to the publisher. So the finalization process would take an hour. That's what I'd allocate. But the gestation process would be it would just depend. And one of the things that happens sometimes is if I'm thinking about an article, I'll wake up in the morning and the article will have written itself in my head overnight,
Hmm.
or just go and I get all the stuff down.
It's really interesting. So you've written a lot of articles. How many articles do you think you've written? You have any idea?
Yeah, I had to quantify that about a year ago. It's over 250 or 300 between Forbes, HBR, MIT.
Wow.
Yeah.
How do you know when you're done with an article? How do you know when it's ready to press? How do you know when you're ready to press send?
Um, Well, again, I try to make it a closed-end process. Like I'm not going to spend an infinite amount of time. So,
Yeah.
basically, when it's good enough. I think in my book, the opening, whatever you call it, like the opening quote in the book is. Yes, in the preface, it's from Voltaire, the French writer, being like the literature major, and it says, "Perfect is the enemy of good." So
Hmm.
I'm a big believer in that. So, it's not like I'm writing, War and Peace or The Great Gatsby. I'm writing a piece for Forbes or something.
Yeah. Do they clean it up after with their editorial process, or do they just say it's good for Randy, good for us, we'll publish it?
So for Forbes, I have reached the state where I self-publish, so they don't get to touch it.
Oh.
For Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Review, it's different. They touch it, and they do a good job on adding things.
Hmm.
So yeah, but again, it's for me, enemy is perfection is the enemy of good.
Yeah. I know what you mean. Like every day I write. I try and write between 1,000 and 2,000 words. For me, it's word count. Um, but I view it as just an exercise in thinking, right? So even
That's,
if it never goes to print, it's just one of those things where you're. I still think even in the age of generative AI, there's no substitute for, like you say, going on walks, letting an idea gestate. I'm an obsessive user of legal pads and pens. Like I just jot everything and draw everything out, and write, right? But that's more to, I think, sharpen the thoughts versus maybe not, publishing anything. Like you see all the instruments in my background too. I mean, I make a lot of music. None of it really ever sees the light of day, but it's just to sharpen your skills in that area. And I view writing as very much a similar activity. Do you view writing as more of work or of an art form for you, or some
well,
mix in between, or how do you view your writing?
Well, you kind of said it yourself. You said it sharpens your thoughts. So what it
Yeah.
does is it forces you to sharpen your thinking. So often from that process, your thinking becomes more refined. So I view it as both it's both a discipline, but it's a creative process as well.
Hmm.
These days the things I write are pretty formulaic. I'm about to write a new story, and I spoke to the chief AI officer of a Fortune 1000 company this morning. They're going to write that story about, and I said, so basically, at this stage, it's formulaic. The first paragraph is kind of about your organization, so people have a sense of your organization and something that you're going to be doing now that's going to change things. And then I get into a little bit of the history of how you've operated over the years and why forces in the marketplace or customers are dictating that you need to do something a little bit different. And then I talk about the person, the chief AI officer or chief data officer, and how they came to this. And I conclude with something that makes it exciting and puts it into perspective. And then just before that, in the middle, I try to put in a couple examples to make it tangible and real, but not too far down in the weeds. So that's pretty
Okay.
much the process that I follow.
Interesting. But then you also write, your annual report for Wavestone, and then you write a book. So in the annual reports that you tend to do, well, more often every year, or do you do more type of industry reports than that, or is that just the big one that you do?
Just one a year.
Yeah. So what's that process like of coming up with that report? It seems like it's a lot of information in there.
Yeah, it's funny because basically I execute the survey over the course of a month. It's a highly curated survey. So, what I mean by that is, though it's anonymous in terms of the participants, everybody's by invitation only. They're only
Mm,
C executives for the most part. And so I know who's responded in terms of the organization. So it lists the organizations that participate, but it doesn't say who within those organizations. So, as opposed to surveys that are sent out to 1,000 people and get like whatever number of responses, but it's unknown, who they were and where they are. So, once the survey is closed after a month, because they have to spend a lot of time, and it's relationship driven. So some people I have to send 9 messages to, then I have to send a text, and, maybe
yeah.
even call them, and they're like, oh yeah, we're apologetic, we'll do it right now. But then then I look at the data, what's the end results, and that's the amazing part because the story pretty much tells itself. This year there
Mhm.
were 5 themes that came out of it, but the data pretty much painted this picture. The first finding is leading companies continue investments in data and analytics with the expectation of delivering business value. Number 2, companies see generative AI as potentially the most transformative technology in a generation. 3, companies believe the CDO, CDAO role is necessary, although turnover has been high and tenure is short.
Mm,
4, companies recognize that integrating data and AI into traditional business processes and changing organizational culture requires time and commitment. And then lastly, companies believe data and AI safeguards and governance are essential, but much more needs to be done. So the data pretty much tells the story, and then you just need to put a little bit. The survey is the one thing where I let the data speak for itself. So
sure.
there's just a little bit of, I'll articulate those findings, but then I'm just showing the data.
What's been the response to your latest report?
It's actually been astonishing because I posted it on LinkedIn on January 2nd, the day that it was published, and it was actually like for the stuff that I post, it was like a record response. Like as of today, there's 37,000 impressions,
Well,
39 reposts. So that's. I mean, the average article I do is, maybe 5,000
mm,
impressions. Some of the HBR things I've done have gotten, 20, 25,000 impressions, but to get 37, 38,000 impressions is pretty extraordinary. So, and I think a lot of that has to do with the AI, particularly with the AI component this year.
yeah, I mean, I've seen it floating around. I think some people I've seen it in LinkedIn. You have those little slide decks that put it
Yeah.
in. So I was like, I don't know if Randy approved that or not, but it looks pretty cool. So I took a glance at it. But it seems popular. Like people in my circle are even pointing to it, which like I said, our worlds typically don't necessarily intersect too much. But even people in my universe are like, yeah, this report's really
You
good.
know,
So
it's free PR. You want it to get out there. It's
yeah,
somebody once said to me, I thought it was like so funny. They said, "Do you get paid for the articles that you write?" And I said, like, "Wow." I said, what an interesting question. I said, from my perspective, it's getting millions of dollars of free publicity and free advertising.
Exactly. Yeah. Same with podcasts. People ask me, do you get do people pay you to be on podcasts, or do you pay people? And I'm like, no, that's not the point of it. Like, the money comes through other ways, right? I
Yeah,
think, especially for you, like your surveys, it's a lot of work, but it adds a ton of value to the conversation that people are having. Because otherwise, it's a lot of guesswork, right? And I would say, like, the stuff that you're doing is it's directly tied to real C-suite executives doing the work, right? And I think that's the advantage you have, versus just the thing I like about what you're doing is you're actually out there getting the data and putting in the work versus just being like a pundit who's like, hey, AI is pretty cool, go check it out. So
yeah. I
it's easier
mean,
too.
when I ran the company for 20 years, the idea was, I didn't like the idea of, I always stayed away from the word sales. But what I said is if you create credibility through thought leadership, through putting content into the market, from interviewing people, from telling their stories, your phone will ring, or your phone will text or whatever, and people will say, hey, this is something we're trying to figure out. Can you help us? So
Hmm.
from my perspective, it helped create demand, and people came to you rather than you having to knock on their doors.
Hmm. Well, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a good spot to be in. So, but again, if you started charging for it, you could instantly ruin it too.
Yeah, exactly. That's always been my mindset. That there's, I mean, even when I wrote the book, I wrote it as a kind of an additional calling card, a branding thing. And, Tom Davenport, my buddy there, he makes fun of me. He says, I'm the guy that goes to events and gives away his books, signed copies, this type of thing. But it's all an investment in the brand. I didn't write it to make money, that comes from other things.
It does. It does. If you make money off your book, I think you're definitely fortunate, but it's a side effect.
Yeah.
So that's cool. Well, it's great been talking to you. For I guess the final question is, what are you excited about this year? We're recording this at the beginning of 2024. What are you stoked on?
Well, as mentioned, I retire from full time work this month. So it's really a reset in terms of next chapter. And I'm going to continue to write and speak and do some senior advisor and board work and things of that kind. But at the same time, I'm going to try not to take on too much, to be selective, to do only the things that really excite me. And, that will play out over time. But I'm going to try to, I told somebody this morning I was going to be deleting as much as possible. So I'm going to try to, go back to bare bones a little bit, and, listen to things, but be very selective and not overcommit.
That's so cool. I'm happy for you. So it's awesome. Well, thanks for being on the podcast too. I guess all that said, so you got a lot of options, including doing nothing at all. So, but it's been
My
great talking to you, man.
pleasure.
Yeah, anytime, man.
Speaking with
Well,
you.
thank you.